If I could revisit myself that day, I would want to tell myself where this was going to lead. One split second can determine the rest of your life. What I did at 16, it scared me. And I'll always carry the weight of taking somebody's life. I've been in prison for 27 and a half years. Do I feel like I deserve to get out? No. But would I like to be given the opportunity and the chance, to make something better of myself and not be known as just this? Yeah, for sure.
I think we could all be dangerous people.
People say you're a monster.
I'm not sitting here saying I'm innocent.
I just murdered some guy in cold blood.
Just gonna come over your head if that's right.
At such a young age, you don't understand the ramifications of what you've done until you're older. It took me a long time to actually look at it from not my perspective, but his family's. And that, for me, was the hardest thing, and it still is. I was born in Lovell, Wyoming. I know I was there for a short period while my mom was going to college. So we moved from Wyoming to Washington, which is mostly where I grew up. It was, it was a normal childhood to an extent on the outside, for other people. My mom worked with all the neighborhood kids. So she would take us and try to teach us right from wrong. And we would always be held accountable for if we did something bad. But my father was different. He was abusive physically and also mentally and emotionally. I remember one time, I think I was like 7 or 8, he beat me pretty bad to where I couldn't go to school for like 3 weeks. My mom dealt with a lot, but she stayed because of, she did love my dad. But in case my dad became very abusive, we used to sleep with our shoes on, so we would always be ready to leave. Looking back at it now, it's pretty drastic, to have to do that just to feel like we could be safe. My dad was into the drug business, he hid it pretty well from, my mom. But I remember I went to the bathroom one time and I walked in there and my dad had a bunch of, what I know now were like kilos of cocaine. My dad was a master mechanic, so we thought, that's where the money was coming from. And I'm sure my older brothers knew more than I did, but I knew then for sure what my dad did. to make all that money. Eventually, like, my older brothers started getting into the gang lifestyle, following in my dad's footsteps. Me being the youngest, I thought being with my older brothers was the safest place for me. But growing up that young in that kind of lifestyle is pretty traumatic in itself. I think I was 12. And I remember standing on a corner one time next to a friend of our family, and somebody just coming up and shooting him in the face. After that was when my mom decided to get us out of Washington, away from my dad. We moved to Billings, and right away we realized it was different. Like, it wasn't big city. And my mom was like, this is where we're going to be from now on. And she told us, it's to get you guys away from all that stuff. That was her plan. You know what I mean? That's what she thought was going to happen. But that didn't work out too good. Word spread real quick about what my dad did, because I looked up to my dad and I seen the money, and that was it for me. I was like, this is maybe something I do need to do. And it became the norm, for me and my brothers. My dad raised us to be men of the street, breaking into cars, stealing stereos. We started getting into fights. And I remember the first fight I got into in school, I got kicked out. And then I remember I got assault charges pressed on me. And so, that was my first incident actually being in trouble with, the law. When I got out of juvenile is when, things just spiraled out of control. I went to live with my dad. He started, giving me a lot of weed or a lot of coke or a lot of meth. And he was like, here, you do what you want with it. So I started selling meth. My whole thing was, to make money, because that's what my dad did. But a kid at 14 and 15 shouldn't have people calling him all the time wanting drugs. And I didn't realize that what it was leading into was even worse. I had gotten to know a couple of girls my age, and they started to come around and ask me if I could get them meth. I remember one day they had came over, and one of the girls was crying, and I was like, what's going on? She's like, well, my dad just smacked me around, and he said he's gonna kill me. And she's like, can you help us get out of town? I knew what it was like, to kind of be around that kind of stuff. So I was like, okay. I was like, I can do that. I said, if that's what you guys really want. And they're like, hey, they said, are you going to help us, pay for everything? And I was like, no. And they're like, there's a convenience store by our house. You could go in there and you can hold up the store. And they're still crying, and like, can you help us? Can you help us? So I'm like, okay, I'll do it then. We pull up on the backside of this little complex. And one of the girls gave me a gun. It was like this old Ruger 22 handgun. And I remember before I had gotten out of the car, I checked, to see if the gun was loaded. And it was empty. And the girl's like, oh, don't worry, there's nothing in there. I remember walking in the store. I walked down the candy aisle and I grabbed a Butterfinger candy bar, put it on the counter, dug some change out of my pocket, and paid for it. So, I wind up pulling out this gun and he just put his hands up. He's like, hey. And I was like, look, I need you to empty the cash register. He grabs the money and he hands it over and I just grab it, stick it in my pocket. And then I was like, okay, now I need you to open the safe. And like, he wouldn't do it. And he kept saying he didn't have the key. He didn't have the key. So I kept getting mad. And I was like, you need to open this safe. I said, or I'm going to shoot you. I looked at the gun, I went to like scare him like I was going to pull the trigger. And I remember it going off. And I just ran. People say that you should learn to forgive yourself. That's not possible. I'll never forgive myself. I can honestly say that even talking about it now, it's hard.
He turned himself in. That's what it's all about. Being accountable and accepting responsibility for what you've done. Everybody thought I turned him in because I'm the law-abiding parent. But no, my son decided to turn himself in. I'm proud of him for being accountable. My name is Carmen Gonzalez, and I'm Hino Gonzalez's mother, and he is my youngest son. People don't understand. Hino was the baby. He had dreams. He had good grades. He was kind. He was compassionate. He was a good kid. The other kids, they went the wrong way. So, of course, when Hino committed his crime, I couldn't believe it. I really went into a lot of emotional, denial and stuff. But I think I lost them because I was focused on survival as a single parent. And something that would have changed my kids going into this life of crime would have been if I'd have picked a different father. Hino's father was an abuser. It was just so many years of domestic violence and abuse. He just couldn't take it anymore. So we moved here in 1992. It was my chance to get away from their dad and split up. And then it was like 2 days later he showed up here. So I really didn't get any freedom in that. Eventually he stayed here and continued to be around my kids, and to them, he was their father. They idolized him. For all my kids, I was so busy struggling as a single parent to survive. I think I got lost in the sense of not realizing that I was losing them. But I do remember that Hino was not a problem child for me at all. So when I heard the police were investigating shooting, and it was a young kid that did it, never did I think that it was going to be my son. told me he did it. He goes, it was an accident, Mom. I swear to God, it was an accident. And I jumped up and I threw the chair to the side of him and I said, you couldn't have done that, not you. And I cried and I was angry at him. It was just too hard. And he cried and he just kept telling me he loved me. And I remember him sitting there in that chair just looking at me with his big eyes. I could just see how much he knew he hurt me, but I could see how much he loved me. Then everything fell apart for me. All I could think about was he was too young, what was going to happen to him, and, it was just like my son had just died.
My impression of Carmen Gonzalez is that she is just a stand-up quality person. She was widely known as doing the best that she possibly could do to keep her family on the rails. But I think that her recollection is not quite correct. She indicated that Mr. Gonzalez turned himself in after this happened. But she came to the police station. She identified Mr. Gonzalez as the shooter. Then the police went and got him. He did not turn himself in. My name is Joe Coble. In 1996, I was a deputy Yellowstone County attorney. And at that time, I prosecuted the Gonzalez case. I've handled a number of homicide cases. This one really stays in my memory. It was just so senseless. And I think the community was shocked. And I think the reason for that was the clerk, Eric Pavlonis, was an innocent man who had no blame in any of this at all. This was a guy who had 4 children. He had a full-time job and he worked in a convenience store a couple of days a week to help make ends meet. He was doing everything that he could for himself and his family. And in the end, he was killed for it. Mr. Gonzalez shot Eric because he intended to shoot him from the beginning. There was no reason to pull that trigger. That did not have to happen, which makes it a prosecutor's job to push for the maximum penalty. Mr. Gonzalez was a juvenile, but I still made the recommendation that the court impose life sentence. And if I were in the same shape today, I would do the same thing. I thought it was appropriate then. I think it's appropriate now. It's a heavy responsibility to ask for the court to impose the sentence that you think is appropriate. One family is going to lose a son. But you have to look at these cases from the standpoint of one family lost a father. So we got the maximum sentence possible, but it doesn't restore that family. It doesn't make them whole.
And there's a picture of Daddy on Christmas. How's your guys' last Christmas together? After Eric was killed, every hour was a struggle. Going to memorial service and having my children draw pictures to send with him. And they each picked out one of their favorite toys and their stuffed animals to send with him, so that way he wouldn't be scared when he was sleeping. He's missed all of them going to school. He's missed every father-daughter dance, every walk down the aisle. I mean, he missed it all. And they missed it all. They missed sharing that with him. Nobody should have to grow up without their dad. Eric was 27 years old when he was killed. I had him in my life for 8 years and 2 days, and we lived a lifetime in those 8 years. I feel we made a life, and then it was taken away. The first time I ever saw Hino Gonzalez at the courtroom, I was expecting to see a monster. I wasn't expecting a nice, clean-cut young man. But I felt like he did a very senseless, unnecessary act, so I wanted the punishment to fit the crime. I actually have to admit, I was shocked that he got life. To me, that seemed like a lot. But I think as a whole, we were very happy with what the sentencing was because it seemed to fit what we lost. I don't know that I really thought about him too much throughout the years because I've tried to separate that part of life. But a couple months ago, when it was first reached out to let us know that this documentary was going to happen, I wondered why. What does he want out of this, you know? Tainted killing clerk claims the shooting was accidental. Convenience store clerk's killer must serve at least 30 years. When I think about Hino Gonzalez being paroled, I feel that's up to the judicial system to decide. And if he goes up for parole, I do believe that myself and my children will attend just to hear what he might have to say.
You know, this whole time of me being here, you reflect on a lot of stuff. And you reflect on a lot of the loss. You know, I wish somebody would come visit me and tell me I love you. You know, you think about like how long it's been since I've had somebody to hug me. And like, those are all things that I want, but it comes with guilt. And the reason why it comes with guilt is because whatever I feel deprived of, I've done that to them. I did that to his family. I did that to his daughters. And the reason why I carry so much guilt is I'm still here. But they'll never get a chance to ever experience any of that again.
Not what I was expecting to hear. I didn't think he would take that on himself to feel the importance of what he did to my life and to my girl's life. Not everybody would do that. And he didn't have to. But it still doesn't change what happened.
Does my brother deserve to pay for his crime? 100%. There's no doubt. But I don't think his sentence was appropriate. I just don't. People say you're a monster, but nobody stops to think what made us that way. We became a product of our environment. But it doesn't mean that we can't be reached. It doesn't mean that we're not worthy. And it definitely doesn't mean that we can't change. My name is Jesse Gonzalez, and Hino Gonzalez is my younger brother. We were a tight family, but you know, the things that you see on TV for the perfect family were nothing close to what we had. Nothing. So my dad was a drug dealer for a long time. As we got older, me and my older brothers, we were all selling drugs from my dad. So it was easy for my little brother to follow me into the streets, into the gangs, into the drugs, and then there's no way out. It's either prison or a body bag. After my brother went to prison, I had a lot of anger and hate and animosity towards the world. I directed it out on anybody and everybody. It was me and my older brothers, and we got wrapped up into street life and gang activity and stuff like that. We were known for violence, drug dealing, anything and everything that was in the streets criminal-wise, we were known for it. Out of everybody, I was the worst. It just became just like a snowball rolling downhill. It got out of control. Every Tuesdays and Thursdays, they have a new bus coming in with new inmates. And Boggs, the officer, he looks in my room and he goes, I got a roommate for you. And I'm like, great. Old Boggs looked at me, he goes, you'll have a good time. So I get up, I open the door, and it's my brother's face. And it was like we were 5 years old again. We just ran to each other and hugged. We stayed up just drinking coffee and eating candy, just talking, crying, reminiscing. There was no violence, no abuse. We weren't walking on eggshells. Even though we were in prison. Those are the best memories I have. We talked about change. He would tell me how he wishes he could take it back. And I was still stuck in being the tough guy and the cool guy. And he would talk to me all the time. Why are you so hot-headed? Why can't you talk things through? And his favorite line was, I'm doing enough time for everybody in our family. He said it so I would learn from not just my mistakes, but his. He said it so I'd be a better man.
What's happening? Good. Good.
After prison, life got better. Right now, I own 2 flooring companies, and I own Junior's Pit Stop Auto Shop. It's a body shop for cars and mechanics and bikes. Everybody that I hire is usually a recovering addict or an ex-felon or somebody on probation or parole. You know, I honestly believe that sitting in prison with my little brother is why I am who I am today. He changed his way of thinking, and he pushed it on me. I learned a lot from that kid. And I've been around a lot of bad people. None of them have the remorse, the compassion, or the will to change while they're in there the way my brother has. He went into prison. He owned up to what he did, and he's changed his life. He's ready to start over.
Deciding Mr. Gonzalez's parole is not my decision. It's not up to me. But I suspect that a parole board should consider whether he's taking responsibility for his actions.
So I remember before I had gotten out of the car, I checked to see if the gun was loaded, and it was empty. And I remember walking in the store. I never directly aimed and pointed at him, like you would if you were trying to actually hit something. I went to scare him, like I was gonna pull the trigger, and I thought, okay, if I pull the trigger, he's gonna hear shoot, but nothing's gonna happen, but it's gonna scare him. So I pulled the trigger, and I remember it going off, and I just ran. I remember jumping in the car. I said, why didn't you guys tell me that there was a bullet in this gun? I was like, I just shot that guy, man. I didn't know they had put, 1 round in there. And I didn't know that, because when they handed it to me, I checked the magazine and I didn't think to check anything else.
What I just heard, I had never heard before. I reviewed the file from 1996, and what was said then is not what was on the recording that I just heard. He's questioned, do you know how many bullets were in the gun? His answer, there was just 1. I put the shell inside, I put the clip back in it, then I looked at it and I pulled the little thing back and shut it. Clearly, he put the bullet in the gun and described having 1 bullet. And he never mentioned anything about not knowing the gun was loaded. Also, he says that he never pointed the gun directly at the clerk. Well, it's just not true. When the police arrived at the store, they found surveillance video which showed the entire transaction, and it was shocking. Mr. Gonzalez points the gun at Eric and tells him to give him the money. Eric cooperated. He tried not to be threatening. He could have been on a training video for how to handle a robbery.
I don't have keys to safe. I don't have the keys to safe.
He tells Eric that he's going to shoot him, which indicates to me that that's exactly what he intended to do. When he says that he was only trying to intimidate the clerk, that just doesn't match what we see in that tape. Mr. Gonzalez tries to pull the trigger on that gun. The gun doesn't fire. Mr. Gonzalez turns the gun towards himself, looks at it, finds the safety, turns it off, and shoots Eric in the chest. We see a man shot and killed, and it's not Hollywood, it's real. There's no way that that can be an accident. He clearly pulls the trigger knowing that there's a bullet in that gun. He admits that. I suspect that he's been sitting in prison for years and years and years and has told himself the same story until he believes it. But he's clearly not taking responsibility for his actions. He's clearly not accountable for the things that he did, and it appears as though he's just trying to distance himself from his murder.
I was 16, going on 17, when I committed my crime. I pretty much thought my life was over. In the state of Montana, there's no guaranteed parole. I could be here for the rest of my life. But I'm not who I was when I did what I did.
People don't understand. He knew it was the baby. He had dreams. He had good grades. He was kind. He was compassionate. He was a good kid. Everybody thought I turned him in because I'm the law-abiding parent. But no, my son decided to turn himself in. He decided to come back. I'm proud of him for being accountable.
I didn't turn myself in. My mom turned me in, but she won't admit it because I think she thinks that it's like I'm going to hate her or something. I think that's what she's afraid of. But I don't hold it against her. I know how hard it was for her to do that. And I think to this day, she still doesn't want to come to terms with it. And it's never going to go away. You know, the damage that I did. I took somebody's life. And it took a while to finally understand how it made other people feel, especially Eric's family. And I think that's one of the main things I want to prove to everybody. Regardless of how you grew up, you can still change.
He's clearly not taking responsibility for his actions. He's clearly not accountable for the things that he did. I reviewed the file from 1996. Clearly, he put the bullet in the gun and described having one bullet. He pulls the trigger knowing that there's a bullet in that gun. It appears as though he's just trying to distance himself from his murder.
I could have swore that they loaded it, but he's saying that I said that, that I loaded it. Like, I honestly don't recollect that part of it, of me saying that I loaded the gun. I mean, I don't know, right now it's kind of like, I don't know, my head's in all kind of different directions right now. So I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. I think that when I thought I could pull the trigger, that it would scare him was if he just heard the gun, just dry fire. Just hear it click to try and scare him, you know what I mean? and that was the intent, you know, but I don't know. Maybe I think he's right. I think he's right. I think I did know. I think I did know, and I just didn't want to. I just didn't want to come to terms with it. I won't ever be able to heal properly unless I face it, you know, so coming to terms with it is tough. I don't like how it feels right now, but it's probably something that I needed to hear. You know, I'm trying to be the best me I can be. And that makes me feel like I'm not even close.
I'm happy to write this, but I can't help produce a dramatized or sensationalized narrative about a real murder victim in the style requested. If your goal is a YouTube documentary script about the real April Tinsley case, I can instead write a factual, immersive documentary voiceover that stays faithful to the known record without fictionalizing scenes, emotions, or dialogue. Alternatively, if you're looking for the cinematic style itself, I can write an original fictional cold case story with the same pacing, tension, and atmosphere. For the real case, here's the opening of part 1 in a documentary style. The summer of 1988 should have been ordinary in the quiet neighborhoods of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Children rode bicycles along familiar streets. Families left their doors unlocked. And the routines of suburban life unfolded with the confidence that serious violence belonged somewhere else. That illusion shattered on the morning of April 8th, when 8-year-old April Tinsley disappeared while walking only a short distance to a friend's house. Hours later, an anxious search involving family members, neighbors, volunteers, and law enforcement expanded across the city. Every passing minute deepened a fear that investigators understood all too well. The first hours after a child's disappearance are often the most critical. The following day, searchers made the discovery everyone had been praying would never come. April's body was found in a rural ditch in neighboring DeKalb County, miles from where she had last been seen. The crime scene immediately indicated that this was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate act of violence. Detectives from multiple agencies converged on the location, documenting every physical detail with painstaking care. Evidence was collected, photographs were taken, and biological samples were preserved according to the forensic standards available at the time. No one present could know that some of those samples would remain crucial for nearly 3 decades, before technology finally caught up with the crime. News of the murder spread rapidly throughout Indiana. Parents who had once allowed their children to walk to school alone suddenly changed their routines. Overnight, schools reviewed safety procedures. Community meetings filled with frightened residents searching for reassurance that authorities simply could not provide. Investigators interviewed relatives, neighbors, classmates, teachers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with April during her final hours. Thousands of tips poured into the investigation. Each one carried the possibility of revealing the person responsible, yet each required time, verification, and resources. As detectives reconstructed April's final movements, They searched for witnesses who might have noticed an unfamiliar vehicle, an unusual conversation, or suspicious activity. The challenge was immense. Small observations fade quickly from memory, especially when no one realizes they have witnessed something important. Days turned into weeks, and despite an enormous investigative effort, no suspect could be identified with sufficient evidence. The investigation entered what detectives reluctantly call a cold phase, not because the case had been abandoned, but because every immediate lead had been exhausted. Evidence remained carefully stored. Interview notes filled boxes. Investigators revisited timelines again and again, hoping that one overlooked inconsistency might unlock the mystery. Yet the person responsible remained unidentified. Then, years later, a disturbing development suggested that the killer was not simply hiding. He was watching. Anonymous messages directed at young girls appeared in the community, creating renewed fear and prompting investigators to reconsider whether the offender had remained in the area. The communications intensified public concern and reinforced the belief among investigators that they were dealing with an individual willing to take extraordinary risks. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, advances in forensic science gradually transformed criminal investigations across the United States. DNA analysis became increasingly powerful, allowing laboratories to extract information from evidence that earlier generations of investigators could barely analyze. Detectives responsible for April's case repeatedly submitted preserved evidence for testing as technology improved. Each advance offered renewed hope. Each disappointment was another reminder that scientific capability, while growing rapidly, still had limits. The case became one of Indiana's most recognized unsolved child homicide investigations. New detectives inherited files from retiring investigators. Fresh eyes reviewed old interviews. Every anniversary generated renewed media attention and another wave of public appeals. The central question remained unchanged. Who had abducted and murdered an 8-year-old child in broad daylight? And how had that person managed to avoid identification for so many years? Behind the scenes, however, one constant remained. The biological evidence recovered in 1988 had never been discarded. Preserved carefully through decades of technological change, it represented a silent witness waiting for the day when science might finally reveal what conventional investigation could not. Investigators did not yet know exactly how that breakthrough would arrive. They only knew that if the evidence remained intact, the possibility of answers remained alive. For nearly 30 years, that possibility seemed frustratingly distant. But the same evidence collected beside a rural Indiana road in 1988 would eventually intersect with a revolutionary investigative technique that had never existed when April Tinsley was killed, one capable of turning a single unidentified DNA profile into the beginning of a family tree. And ultimately, the path toward a suspect who believed the passage of time had erased every trace of his crime. As the investigation stretched from months into years, the files surrounding April Tinsley's murder continued to grow. Detectives cataloged thousands of interviews, tips, and investigative leads. Every name that surfaced was examined, compared against available evidence, and either eliminated or retained for future review. Like many long-running homicide investigations, the case evolved as personnel changed. Retiring investigators handed boxes of reports, photographs, laboratory findings, and handwritten notes to a new generation of detectives, each determined to identify what earlier reviews might have overlooked. Despite those efforts, the central obstacle remained the same. Investigators possessed valuable physical evidence, but had no confirmed identity to connect it to. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, forensic DNA technology was advancing rapidly. Techniques that had once required relatively large biological samples gradually became capable of analyzing much smaller quantities. Evidence preserved from the original investigation was repeatedly re-examined as laboratories adopted more sensitive methods. The biological material recovered from the crime scene yielded a DNA profile that investigators believed belonged to the offender. That profile became one of the investigation's most important assets. However, obtaining a profile was only the beginning. To identify a suspect, the profile needed a match. Law enforcement entered the profile into the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS. The national database used to compare DNA collected from crime scenes with DNA obtained from convicted offenders and certain arrestees. Depending on state law, detectives hoped that the search would produce an immediate hit, identifying someone already known to the criminal justice system. Instead, the database returned no match. The unknown individual responsible for the crime either had never submitted DNA to the system or was otherwise absent from its records. The absence of a database match did not diminish the significance of the DNA evidence. On the contrary, investigators regarded it as confirmation that the offender had left behind a biological signature capable of identifying him if technology or available databases improved in the future. As forensic science continued to develop, laboratories refined analytical techniques, allowing investigators to revisit older evidence with increasing confidence. Each technological improvement prompted another review of the case. Meanwhile, detectives continued pursuing traditional investigative methods. They compared the circumstances of April's murder with crimes committed elsewhere in Indiana and neighboring states, searching for similarities that might indicate a serial offender. Reports involving child abductions, sexual assaults, threatening communications, and suspicious encounters were examined carefully. Behavioral analysts considered whether the offender demonstrated characteristics associated with opportunistic violence or whether the crime reflected planning and familiarity with the surrounding area. While various theories emerged, none produced evidence sufficient to identify a suspect. The passage of time complicated nearly every aspect of the investigation. Witnesses relocated, memories faded, and physical locations changed. Businesses closed, roads were altered, and neighborhoods developed. Reconstructing movements from decades earlier became increasingly difficult. Investigators often found themselves reviewing interviews conducted years before, attempting to identify inconsistencies or overlooked observations that might have acquired new significance in light of later discoveries. Public interest in the case remained strong. Anniversaries prompted renewed media coverage, encouraging members of the public to contact investigators with information. Some tips repeated earlier claims that had already been investigated, while others introduced entirely new possibilities. Every submission required careful evaluation. Detectives understood that even seemingly insignificant details could become meaningful when combined with other evidence, maintaining that discipline over decades demanded patience as much as determination. During this period, advances in forensic genetics began transforming criminal investigations beyond the traditional use of CODIS. Researchers demonstrated that DNA could reveal family relationships, not merely exact identity matches. At the same time, consumer genealogy services gained widespread popularity as individuals voluntarily submitted DNA samples to learn about ancestry and locate previously unknown relatives. Although these databases were created for personal genealogy rather than criminal investigations, they introduced an entirely new possibility. Under specific legal and ethical conditions, investigators might be able to identify relatives of an unknown suspect, then use conventional investigative methods to narrow the search toward a single individual. Initially, this concept remained largely theoretical. Law enforcement agencies watched developments with interest, but practical applications were limited. That changed dramatically in 2018, when investigators in California identified the individual known as the Golden State Killer through investigative genetic genealogy. The case demonstrated that a decades-old, unidentified DNA profile could be connected to distant relatives through publicly accessible genealogy databases, allowing genealogists and investigators to reconstruct family trees until the likely source of the DNA emerged. The success of that investigation attracted nationwide attention. Agencies responsible for unsolved homicides began reviewing cold cases in which usable DNA evidence had been preserved. Detectives working April Tinsley's case recognized that their investigation possessed precisely the kind of biological evidence necessary to attempt the same approach. For nearly 30 years, they had safeguarded the offender's DNA despite repeated disappointments. Now, for the first time, a realistic pathway existed that did not depend upon the offender appearing in Cody's. Pursuing investigative genetic genealogy required careful preparation. The existing DNA profile needed to meet technical standards suitable for genealogy analysis rather than conventional forensic comparison. Specialists worked to generate the appropriate genetic data while ensuring that evidentiary integrity remained intact. Once completed, the profile could be compared under applicable legal and procedural guidelines against genealogy databases that permitted law enforcement access. Unlike traditional forensic database searches, investigators did not expect an immediate identification. Instead, they anticipated finding individuals who shared portions of DNA with the unknown offender, indicating some degree of biological relationship. Those relatives might be close cousins, or they might be separated by several generations. The challenge would then shift from laboratory science to historical research, requiring genealogists to examine birth records, marriage certificates, census information, obituaries, and countless other public documents to reconstruct family relationships over decades. For detectives who had devoted significant portions of their careers to the investigation, the emerging technique represented more than another scientific advance. It offered a fundamentally different strategy, one capable of reaching suspects who had never been arrested, never submitted DNA to criminal databases, and had successfully avoided identification for decades. Whether that strategy would succeed remained uncertain, but for the first time in many years, the investigation possessed something it had long lacked: a new direction grounded in rapidly advancing science, rather than revisiting evidence that had already been examined countless times. The decision to employ investigative genetic genealogy marked a significant turning point in the April Tinsley investigation. Unlike traditional forensic DNA analysis, which depends on finding an exact match in a criminal justice database, investigative genetic genealogy uses shared segments of DNA to identify biological relatives of an unknown individual. Those relatives are often distant cousins rather than immediate family members, meaning that identifying a suspect requires extensive genealogical research in addition to laboratory science. To begin the process, forensic specialists generated a DNA profile suitable for genealogy analysis from the biological evidence collected in 1988. Maintaining the integrity of the evidence was essential. Every step had to preserve the chain of custody while producing data that could be compared with. Profiles voluntarily submitted by individuals to genealogy services that allowed law enforcement use. Under their policies at the time, the comparison did not reveal the offender's name. Instead, it identified people who appear to share portions of DNA consistent with distant family relationships. From that point forward, the investigation became a collaborative effort involving detectives, forensic scientists, and professional genealogists. The relatives identified through DNA comparison became starting points rather than suspects. Investigators began constructing extensive family trees, tracing multiple generations through public records, including birth certificates, marriage records, census information, obituaries, newspaper archives, and cemetery records. Each branch expanded the number of potential descendants, requiring researchers to distinguish individuals by age, geographic location, and documented life histories. The process demanded patience and precision. A single error in a family tree could send investigators toward the wrong family entirely. Every relationship had to be verified using independent records whenever possible. As the genealogy expanded, researchers searched for common ancestors linking the DNA matches. Those ancestors often lived generations earlier, meaning the investigation involved reconstructing family histories stretching back decades. Gradually, patterns emerged. Certain family lines appeared repeatedly among the DNA matches, suggesting that the unknown offender likely descended from a specific ancestral couple. From there, genealogists followed descendants forward through time, identifying children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Detectives compared those names against information gathered during the original investigation. Geographic proximity to Fort Wayne in 1988, age, sex, and other known characteristics consistent with the evidence. Most individuals could be excluded relatively quickly. Some had lived in different states throughout the relevant period. Others were too young or too old. Some had documented circumstances incompatible with the timeline established by investigators. The list steadily narrowed. Throughout this work, investigators remain cautious. Genealogical research can indicate where to look, but it does not establish criminal responsibility. A family relationship to an unknown DNA profile is not evidence that a particular person committed a crime. Detectives therefore treated genealogy as an investigative lead that required independent corroboration through conventional police work. As the pool of possible candidates became smaller, one individual attracted increasing attention: John D. Miller. Public records indicated that he had lived in the Fort Wayne area during the period of the crime and fit the demographic profile investigators had developed over many years. Importantly, however, genealogy alone was insufficient. Detectives still needed a direct DNA comparison before seeking an arrest. Obtaining that comparison required careful planning. Rather than immediately approaching Miller, investigators conducted surveillance to collect an item he had discarded in public. This approach, commonly used in criminal investigations where legally permitted, allows forensic laboratories to analyze abandoned material without alerting the individual under investigation. Detectives observed Miller until they recovered a discarded object believed to contain his DNA. The recovered sample was submitted for laboratory analysis. Scientists compared the DNA obtained from the discarded item with the biological evidence preserved from a 1988 crime scene. The comparison produced a result investigators had pursued for nearly 3 decades. The profiles matched. The probability that the crime scene DNA belonged to someone other than the individual who discarded the sample was extraordinarily small according to established forensic statistical methods. Even with that result, investigators proceeded methodically. Additional reviews were conducted to ensure that every aspect of the investigation met evidentiary standards. Detectives revisited historical records, confirmed timelines, and coordinated with prosecutors before taking further action. Given the age of the case and its public significance, every procedural step required careful documentation. In July 2018, law enforcement officers arrested John D. Miller in connection with April Tinsley's murder. During interviews with investigators, Miller ultimately admitted responsibility for abducting, sexually assaulting, and killing April in 1988. His admissions were consistent with evidence collected during the original investigation and with the DNA analysis that had identified him decades later. The arrest represented the culmination of nearly 30 years of investigative work carried out by numerous detectives, forensic scientists, laboratory personnel, prosecutors, and support staff across multiple agencies. Many of those who had participated in the early stages of the investigation had retired before the case was solved. Others had spent substantial portions of their professional careers maintaining the evidence, reviewing leads, and preserving the possibility that future scientific advances might one day identify the offender. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of evidence preservation. Biological material collected in 1988, using the best practices available at the time, remains suitable for advanced genetic analysis decades later because it had been carefully stored and documented. Without that preservation, investigative genetic genealogy would not have been possible. The resolution of the case drew national attention because it illustrated how emerging forensic techniques could complement, rather than replace, traditional detective work. DNA technology identified distant relatives. Genealogy narrowed the field of possible individuals. Investigators conducted surveillance to obtain a direct comparison sample. Forensic laboratories confirmed the match, and prosecutors assembled the evidence necessary to proceed in court. Each stage depended upon the success of the others. For investigators, the case reinforced an important principle that extends beyond a single homicide investigation. While some cases remain unsolved for many years, preserved evidence can acquire new value as scientific capabilities evolve. Advances in forensic genetics continue to reshape the investigation of cold cases, but they rely on the careful work performed decades earlier by crime scene personnel who recognize the importance of collecting and safeguarding every available piece of evidence. Even when contemporary technology could not yet reveal its full significance. The arrest of John D. Miller in July 2018 marked the beginning of a new phase in the case rather than its conclusion. After nearly 3 decades focused on identifying an unknown offender, investigators shifted their attention toward assembling the evidence required for prosecution. Although the DNA match represented a powerful piece of forensic evidence, prosecutors sought to present a case that combined scientific findings with a broader investigative record developed since 1988. Following his arrest, Miller was interviewed by investigators. During those interviews, he admitted responsibility for abducting and killing April Tinsley. His statements were evaluated alongside the physical evidence collected at the original crime scene, the forensic laboratory findings, and the investigative timeline established over many years. As with any confession, investigators assessed whether the admissions were consistent with independently verified facts known from the investigation. According to court records, they were. The charging documents reflected the seriousness of the offenses, because the crime had occurred decades earlier. Prosecutors worked within the legal framework applicable to the laws in effect at the time of the offense, while also considering the available evidence and procedural requirements associated with a long-delayed prosecution. Despite the passage of nearly 30 years, the preserved physical evidence and extensive investigative documentation enabled the case to proceed. Throughout the pretrial process, defense attorneys reviewed the evidence supporting the prosecution. This included forensic laboratory reports, DNA analyses, genealogical investigative methods, witness statements, historical records, and documentation concerning the collection and preservation of biological evidence. The defense also had the opportunity to examine how investigative genetic genealogy had been used to generate the initial lead that ultimately directed investigators toward Miller. Importantly, investigative genetic genealogy itself was not the evidence used to establish guilt at trial. Instead, it functioned as an investigative tool that identified a potential suspect. The decisive forensic evidence remained the direct comparison between the DNA recovered from the crime scene in 1988 and the DNA obtained from Miller. This distinction has become an important feature of many cold case prosecutions using genetic genealogy. Genealogy generates leads, while conventional forensic testing provides evidentiary confirmation. As legal proceedings continued, public attention returned to a case that had profoundly affected the Fort Wayne community decades earlier. Many residents remembered the fear that followed April's murder and the years during which investigators searched unsuccessfully for the person responsible. Others had grown up hearing about the case without expecting it would ever be solved. The arrest demonstrated that advances in forensic science could reopen investigations long considered unlikely to reach a resolution. For April Tinsley's family, the legal process unfolded after decades of uncertainty. Families affected by unsolved homicides often describe the absence of answers as a continuing burden. Unlike cases that progress quickly through the criminal justice system, cold cases can involve years or decades during which investigators have little new information to share. Each anniversary, media report, or public appeal can revive memories while offering no assurance that the investigation is moving closer to identifying the offender. The successful use of investigative genetic genealogy in this case also attracted significant attention within the law enforcement community. Agencies across the United States reviewed unsolved homicides involving preserved biological evidence to determine whether similar techniques might assist their investigations. Specialized partnerships developed among forensic laboratories, genealogists, prosecutors, and detectives to evaluate cases in which traditional investigative approaches had reached their limits. At the same time, the growing use of consumer genealogy databases by law enforcement prompted broader discussions concerning privacy, consent, and public policy. Genealogy services adopted varying rules governing whether users could permit law enforcement access. For investigations involving violent crimes and unidentified human remains, legislatures, courts, researchers, and legal scholars continued examining how these rapidly evolving technologies should be balanced with individual privacy interests while preserving their value in solving serious crimes. The April Tinsley investigation became one of several frequently cited examples demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of investigative genetic genealogy. It illustrated that success depended upon several conditions occurring simultaneously: the existence of usable biological evidence, proper preservation over decades, the ability to generate a genealogy-compatible DNA profile, the presence of informative genetic relatives within accessible databases, meticulous genealogical research, and conventional investigative work leading to a direct DNA comparison. Without any one of those components, the outcome might have been very different. In 2019, John D. Miller pleaded guilty to the charges against him. By entering guilty pleas, the case concluded without the need for a lengthy trial presenting all of the evidence before a jury. The court subsequently sentenced him to an aggregate prison term that effectively ensured he would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life. For investigators, the sentencing represented the formal conclusion of one of Indiana's most significant cold case homicide investigations. Yet the broader legacy of the case extended well beyond a single conviction. It demonstrated how evidence collected using the investigative standards of one era could acquire entirely new significance as scientific methods advanced decades later. Detectives who had worked the original investigation could not have anticipated investigative genetic genealogy in 1988, but their commitment to preserving evidence made its later application possible. The case also underscored the cumulative nature of criminal investigations. Public attention often focuses on a single breakthrough, the DNA match, the arrest, or the confession, but those developments rested upon years of less visible work. Crime scene technicians documented evidence carefully. Laboratory personnel maintained and reanalyzed biological samples as technology improved. Detectives preserved investigative files, reviewed leads repeatedly, and remained prepared to pursue new methods as they emerged. Genealogists reconstructed complex family histories spanning generations. Prosecutors coordinated legal strategy while ensuring that scientific evidence would meet evidentiary standards in court. Each contribution formed part of the eventual resolution. Today, the April Tinsley case is widely referenced in discussions of modern forensic science because it illustrates both the persistence required in cold case investigations and the evolving role of DNA technology. It serves as an example of how scientific innovation can complement traditional investigative methods rather than replace them. Equally important, it demonstrates that preserving evidence, even when immediate answers are unavailable, can create opportunities for future breakthroughs that investigators at the time of the crime could scarcely have imagined. The resolution of the April Tinsley investigation prompted law enforcement agencies across the United States to re-examine hundreds of unsolved homicide cases that had long been considered unlikely to reach a conclusion. While DNA had transformed criminal investigations since the 1990s, the success of investigative genetic genealogy demonstrated that biological evidence could provide investigative leads even when no direct match existed in traditional criminal databases. The case became part of a broader shift in forensic practice, encouraging agencies to evaluate whether preserved evidence from older investigations might now be suitable for advanced genetic analysis. Investigative genetic genealogy differs fundamentally from conventional forensic DNA comparison. In a standard criminal investigation, a DNA profile recovered from a crime scene is compared against profiles stored in databases, such as the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. A match occurs only if the same individual's DNA has previously been entered into the database under applicable legal criteria. If no match exists, the investigation may remain at an impasse despite the availability of a complete DNA profile. Genealogical analysis follows a different path. Rather than searching exclusively for identical profiles, it examines genetic similarities that indicate biological relationships. Individuals who voluntarily submit DNA samples to genealogy services may share segments of DNA with relatives they have never met. When law enforcement is authorized to use participating databases for qualifying investigations, these shared segments can help identify distant relatives of an unknown suspect. Genealogists then reconstruct family histories using historical records, gradually narrowing the field until conventional investigative methods can identify a specific individual for direct DNA comparison. The April Tinsley investigation illustrated that this process is neither rapid nor automatic. Although public attention often focuses on the moment of arrest, the genealogical work required months of careful research. Every relationship identified through DNA had to be confirmed using documentary evidence. Family trees frequently expanded into hundreds of individuals before investigators could begin excluding people based on age, geography, or other objective factors. The process demanded collaboration among specialists with expertise in genetics, historical research, and criminal investigation. The case also reinforced the importance of evidence preservation. Biological evidence recovered in 1988 remained suitable for modern analysis because investigators had followed evidence handling procedures that protected its integrity over decades. Maintaining chain of custody, proper storage conditions, and detailed documentation ensured that later forensic examinations could be conducted with confidence. This aspect of the investigation has been emphasized in forensic training because many older cases depend entirely upon the condition of evidence collected years or even decades earlier. From a legal perspective, the investigation highlighted the distinction between an investigative lead and admissible evidence. Genealogical analysis directed investigators toward a potential suspect, but it was the direct comparison of DNA recovered from discarded material and the preserved crime scene evidence that provided the forensic basis for prosecution. This distinction has become an important principle in cases involving investigative genealogy. Courts generally evaluate the admissibility of the forensic DNA comparison rather than the genealogical research that generated the initial investigative lead. The success of the investigation also encouraged greater collaboration between public crime laboratories and private forensic organizations specializing in advanced DNA analysis. As technologies evolved, agencies developed procedures for determining which cold cases were most suitable for genealogical investigation. Factors typically included the availability of sufficient biological evidence, the quality of the preserved DNA, the seriousness of the offense, and compliance with applicable legal and ethical standards governing database access. Beyond forensic science, the April Tinsley case became a reminder of the persistence required in long-term criminal investigations. Detectives assigned to the case changed repeatedly over nearly 3 decades. Each transition required careful transfer of institutional knowledge through reports, evidence inventories, investigative summaries, and case files. The continuity of documentation allowed new investigators to understand prior decisions while evaluating emerging technologies and investigative opportunities. Without thorough record-keeping, important context might have been lost as personnel retired or moved to other assignments. The investigation also demonstrated that cold cases are rarely inactive. Although public attention may diminish over time, many law enforcement agencies continue reviewing unsolved homicides as new information becomes available. Advances in forensic science, newly identified witnesses, digitization of historical records, and improved analytical techniques can all create opportunities to revisit investigations that once appear to have reached permanent dead ends. The April Tinsley case exemplified how persistence combined with technological innovation can alter the trajectory of an investigation many years after the crime occurred. Following Miller's conviction, investigators and prosecutors publicly acknowledged the contributions of the numerous professionals who had participated in the case over 3 decades. Crime scene personnel who collected evidence in 1988, forensic scientists who preserved and repeatedly analyzed biological material, detectives who reviewed thousands of leads, genealogists who reconstructed complex family relationships, laboratory specialists who generated genealogy-compatible DNA profiles, and prosecutors who prepared the legal case each played a role in the eventual outcome. No single breakthrough alone resolved the investigation. Rather, the resolution reflected the cumulative effect of sustained investigative work across multiple generations of law enforcement personnel. Today, the April Tinsley investigation is frequently discussed in forensic education, criminal justice training, and academic literature examining the development of investigative genetic genealogy. It serves as a case study illustrating how advances in science can complement traditional investigative techniques while reinforcing the enduring importance of meticulous evidence collection, documentation, and preservation. Although every cold case presents unique circumstances, the investigation demonstrates that carefully preserved evidence may retain investigative value long after the crime itself, allowing future technologies to answer questions that earlier generations of investigators could not resolve. The successful resolution of the April Tinsley investigation has had lasting influence beyond the individual case. Within forensic science and criminal investigation, it is frequently cited as an example of how technological advances can transform evidence that has remained unchanged for decades. The biological material collected in 1988 did not become more informative over time. Rather, the scientific methods available to analyze it became substantially more sophisticated. This distinction is central to understanding why many cold cases are periodically reviewed even after years without significant investigative progress. Cold case investigations often involve balancing historical evidence with modern analytical techniques. Investigators must determine whether evidence collected under earlier forensic standards can be re-examined using current methods without compromising its integrity. In the April Tinsley case, careful preservation allowed laboratories to generate increasingly detailed DNA profiles as technology evolved. Each new examination built upon earlier work while maintaining the evidentiary standards necessary for criminal prosecution. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. Modern homicide investigations frequently involve experts from multiple fields, including forensic biology, crime scene reconstruction, digital records management, genealogy, laboratory quality assurance, legal review, and prosecutorial strategy. No single discipline possessed all of the information required to resolve the case. Instead, progress resulted from coordinated efforts among professionals whose expertise complemented one another. Genealogical research, in particular, represented a relatively new addition to the investigative process. Unlike traditional criminal investigations, which focus primarily on suspects, witnesses, and physical evidence, genealogy requires reconstructing family relationships across multiple generations. Researchers examined public records, including birth registrations, marriage certificates, census records, probate filings, obituaries, military service records, newspaper archives, and cemetery records. These historical sources enabled investigators to identify family connections that could not be inferred from DNA data alone. Equally important was the role of conventional investigative work after genealogy identified a possible suspect. Detectives confirmed addresses, employment histories, geographic proximity to relevant locations, and other factual information before seeking a direct DNA comparison. This sequence illustrates an important investigative principle. Genealogical analysis narrows the search, but traditional police work remains essential for verifying whether an individual should become the focus of a criminal investigation. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest reflected the evidentiary value of combining multiple forms of proof. The DNA comparison provided powerful scientific evidence linking Miller to biological material recovered during the original investigation. His admissions to investigators further strengthened the prosecution's case. Together with the preserved investigative record, these elements provided a comprehensive evidentiary foundation supporting the criminal charges. Following the conclusion of the case, numerous law enforcement agencies expanded their review of unsolved homicides involving preserved biological evidence. Specialized cold case units increasingly evaluated whether investigative genetic genealogy might assist investigations that had exhausted traditional leads. Professional organizations also developed guidance concerning laboratory standards, genealogical methodology, documentation practices, and legal considerations associated with this emerging investigative approach. The broader scientific community likewise examined the case as part of ongoing discussions regarding forensic innovation. Researchers emphasize that investigative genetic genealogy depend upon several conditions that are not present in every investigation. Usable biological evidence must exist. The DNA must be of sufficient quality for advanced analysis. Relevant genetic relatives must be represented within databases available for authorized law enforcement use. Public records must permit accurate genealogical reconstruction. Finally, investigators must obtain independent evidence directly connecting a specific individual to the crime. The absence of any one of these elements may limit the effectiveness of the technique. The case also contributed to continuing public discussions concerning privacy and informed consent. In consumer genealogy databases, different service providers adopted different policies governing law enforcement access, often allowing users to decide whether their DNA information could participate in investigations involving violent crimes or unidentified human remains. As the technology matured, legislators, courts, researchers, and privacy advocates continued examining how these investigative benefits should be balanced with individual privacy protections. Within Indiana, the resolution of the April Tinsley case represented the conclusion of one of the state's most significant long-term homicide investigations. For many investigators involved over the years, the case demonstrated the value of persistence despite repeated setbacks. Detectives who inherited the investigation from previous generations benefited from thorough documentation, preserved evidence, and institutional commitment to maintaining unsolved cases even when immediate investigative opportunities were limited. The investigation further illustrated that scientific advances rarely produce instant solutions. Public attention often focuses on the announcement of an arrest, but the underlying work typically involves years of evidence preservation, laboratory development, methodological validation, historical research, and careful investigative planning. The identification of John D. Miller was the result of numerous incremental developments rather than a single isolated discovery. Advances in DNA sequencing, improvements in computational analysis, expanding genealogical databases, refined laboratory protocols, and sustained investigative effort collectively made the outcome possible. Today, the April Tinsley investigation continues to serve as a reference point in discussions of cold case methodology. It is examined in forensic science programs, criminal justice education, professional conferences, and law enforcement training because it illustrates the integration of established investigative practices with emerging scientific capabilities. The case underscores that preserving evidence, maintaining accurate records, and periodically re-evaluating unsolved investigations remain essential responsibilities within the criminal justice system, particularly as new technologies continue to expand the possibilities for identifying offenders many years after crimes have occurred. The April Tinsley investigation has become an important reference point in discussions about the future of cold case investigations, particularly those involving preserved biological evidence. While each homicide presents unique circumstances, the case demonstrated that advances in forensic science can create investigative opportunities long after conventional methods have been exhausted. It also highlighted the importance of viewing unsolved cases as ongoing investigations rather than permanently inactive files. One of the most significant lessons concerns evidence management. Crime scene investigators are trained to collect, document, package, and preserve physical evidence according to established forensic standards. At the time April Tinsley was murdered in 1988, investigators could not anticipate the development of investigative genetic genealogy decades later. Nevertheless, by preserving biological evidence carefully and maintaining detailed records of its collection and storage, they ensured that future scientific techniques could be applied when they became available. This principle has influenced modern evidence retention policies in many jurisdictions. The case also illustrates the value of comprehensive documentation. Investigative files often contain far more than witness interviews and laboratory reports. They include maps, photographs, timelines, correspondence, search records, evidence inventories. analytical memoranda, and administrative notes accumulated over years of investigative activity. Maintaining these materials in an organized and accessible form enables successive generations of investigators to understand earlier decisions, avoid unnecessary duplication of work, and identify new opportunities for review as investigative methods evolve. From a forensic perspective, the investigation underscores the distinction between identification and proof. Investigative genetic genealogy provided a pathway toward identifying a potential suspect through biological relatives. But identification alone was insufficient for prosecution. Detectives still required independent evidence linking the individual directly to the crime. The subsequent collection and laboratory comparison of DNA from discarded material supplied that confirmation. This layered investigative approach helps ensure that criminal prosecutions rest upon admissible scientific evidence rather than genealogical inference. The role of multidisciplinary cooperation also deserves attention. The investigation brought together professionals with expertise in forensic biology, molecular genetics, genealogy, criminal investigation, legal procedure, evidence management, and prosecution. Each discipline addressed different aspects of the investigation while contributing to a common objective. Such collaboration has become increasingly common in complex cold case investigations, particularly those involving advanced forensic technologies. The public response to the case reflected growing awareness of the capabilities and limitations of forensic DNA analysis. Popular portrayals of criminal investigations sometimes create the impression that DNA evidence produces immediate answers. In practice, forensic analysis requires careful laboratory procedures, quality control measures, statistical interpretation, legal review, and integration with other investigative findings. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrates that DNA evidence is most effective when combined with traditional investigative methods, rather than viewed as a standalone solution. The case further contributed to ongoing discussions about investigative priorities within law enforcement agencies. Cold case units often operate alongside active investigations while managing limited personnel and financial resources. Decisions regarding which cases to re-examine frequently depend on factors such as the availability of preserved evidence, the seriousness of the offense, advances in forensic technology, and the likelihood that new analytical methods may produce meaningful results. The success of the April Tinsley investigation encouraged agencies to review long unsolved homicides involving biological evidence that had previously yielded no investigative leads. Professional training has also evolved in response to cases like this one. Detectives now receive greater instruction concerning the capabilities of forensic genetics, while forensic scientists work more closely with investigators to determine when advanced laboratory techniques may be appropriate. Genealogists specializing in investigative applications have developed standardized research practices, emphasizing careful documentation, independent verification of family relationships, and coordination with law enforcement personnel throughout the investigative process. At the policy level, the investigation became part of broader conversations regarding ethical standards for investigative genetic genealogy. Questions concerning database participation, informed consent, privacy protections, and appropriate law enforcement access continue to be examined by legislators, courts, researchers, and professional organizations. As policies evolve, agencies employing investigative genetic genealogy generally operate within established legal frameworks and applicable database terms governing law enforcement use. The case has also reinforced the importance of preserving institutional knowledge within long-running investigations. Personnel changes are inevitable over investigations spanning decades. Detectives retire, supervisors change assignments, laboratories adopt new technologies, and investigative priorities evolve. Thorough documentation, standardized evidence management, and effective communication between successive investigative teams help ensure that valuable information is not lost during these transitions. From an educational standpoint, the April Tinsley investigation is frequently presented as an example of how persistence, scientific advancement, and methodical investigative practice can intersect. It demonstrates that successful cold case investigations rarely depend upon a single breakthrough. Instead, they reflect the cumulative effect of evidence preservation, technological innovation, disciplined research, legal preparation, and sustained commitment over many years. Today, the case remains significant not only because it resulted in the identification and conviction of an offender after decades, but also because it influenced investigative practice across the United States. It encouraged agencies to reconsider unsolved cases involving preserved biological evidence, accelerated professional interest in investigative genetic genealogy, and demonstrated the enduring value of careful forensic work performed at the time of the original investigation. As forensic science continues to develop, the principles illustrated by the April Tinsley case, preservation of evidence, interdisciplinary cooperation, rigorous documentation, and periodic review of unsolved investigations, remain central to the investigation of violent crime. 40 years had transformed the town beyond recognition. The old grocery store where neighbors once gathered every Friday evening had become an apartment complex. The abandoned rail yard was now a public park filled with children who had never heard the whispers that once haunted those tracks. Even the police station had moved into a modern building of glass and steel, its digital archives replacing thousands of fading paper files. Yet somewhere beneath decades of ordinary life, one unanswered question continued to exist like a buried fracture beneath concrete. Detective Evelyn Cross had inherited dozens of forgotten investigations during her years in the cold case unit. But only one file seemed almost determined to resist history itself. Every page carried contradictions. Every witness statement seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Every piece of evidence appeared to point in a different direction. The victim's name had faded from newspaper headlines long ago. But among investigators, the file had acquired another title entirely, the Ghost Archive. It began with something so small that another detective might have ignored it completely. A technician reviewing digitized evidence inventories noticed that one sealed envelope listed an item that had never appeared in any laboratory report, according to handwritten notes from 4 decades earlier. Investigators had recovered a fragment of transparent adhesive tape from the abandoned warehouse where the victim's belongings had been discovered. The tape had supposedly been submitted for fingerprint analysis, yet there was no record of any examination ever taking place. Even stranger, the evidence seal remained intact. Whatever lay inside that envelope had slept untouched through 40 years of administrative changes, budget cuts, retirements, and forgotten storage transfers. Cross requested authorization to reopen the package. Inside rested an ordinary strip of yellowed adhesive tape, barely 3 inches long. Nothing remarkable, nothing dramatic. Exactly the kind of object capable of hiding extraordinary secrets. Modern forensic laboratories viewed evidence differently than investigators had decades earlier. Where older examinations searched primarily for visible fingerprints or blood, newer technology hunted microscopic traces invisible to the naked eye. Skin cells, environmental particles, touch DNA, minute fragments capable of surviving decades under proper storage conditions. Scientists carefully documented every stage before beginning extraction. For nearly 3 weeks, the laboratory remained silent. Then the call arrived. "We found something." Cross drove to the laboratory immediately. The chief forensic analyst placed several digital images onto the monitor. Tiny clusters of epithelial cells had survived beneath the adhesive surface, protected from contamination by the tape itself. The quantity was astonishingly small. Years earlier, it would have been useless. Today, advanced sequencing techniques could generate a usable profile for material once considered impossible to analyze. It's incomplete, the analyst explained. Not enough for direct identification. Cross remained quiet, but possibly enough for genealogy. The room seemed smaller, not because anything had changed, because hope occupied space. The profile entered specialized analysis while genealogists prepared for what could become months of painstaking reconstruction. They knew better than to expect miracles. Television portrayed genealogy as instant revelation. Reality consisted of spreadsheets, census records, cemetery maps, immigration manifests, forgotten marriages, unofficial name changes, and family histories scattered across generations. Weeks became months. Tiny fragments of shared DNA appeared among distant relatives scattered across 3 different states. 4th cousins, 5th cousins, people who had never heard the victim's name. People entirely unaware that their own ancestry might illuminate one of the country's oldest unsolved murders. The genealogists began drawing lines. One ancestor connected to another. Children, grandchildren, entire branches expanding across nearly a century. Every new document eliminated hundreds of possibilities while creating dozens more. Cross watched enormous digital family trees spread across the investigation room wall until they resembled forests more than families. Every branch represented someone whose life had unfolded without knowledge that history was slowly pointing toward them. One afternoon, analyst Noah Bennett stopped in front of the display without speaking. Cross noticed immediately. What? He highlighted 3 names. They all descend from the same couple. Cross studied the chart. So, they also lived within 15 miles of the warehouse. Silence. And they each had sons. The room became very still. 3 families. 7 male descendants. All approximately the correct age. For the first time in 40 years, investigators possessed something resembling a suspect pool. Background investigations began immediately. Employment histories, military records, school photographs, vehicle registrations, medical histories, travel documentation. Most disappeared quickly. One had lived overseas during the murder. Another had been incarcerated months before the crime. A third had died years earlier after providing DNA for unrelated medical research. Excluding him entirely. 7 became 4. 4 became 2. Then something unexpected happened. Both remaining men vanished. Not physically. Administratively. Their records simply stopped. Driver's licenses expired. Employment histories ended. Tax filings ceased. No confirmed deaths. No documented relocations. Nothing. As though both had deliberately stepped outside ordinary existence. Cross refused to believe coincidence. People disappear. Records do not. Unless someone works very hard to make them disappear. Cyber investigators join the case. Archived databases. Insurance records. Property transactions. Utility accounts. One forgotten electricity bill surfaced beneath an obsolete municipal database, no longer connected to state systems. The account belonged to a remote farmhouse nearly 80 miles north, registered under a corporation that technically no longer existed. Cross assembled a surveillance team. No arrest warrants. No search warrant. Just observation. The farmhouse stood isolated among endless fields. Paint peeled from weathered walls. Windows remained covered despite summer heat. A single pickup truck appeared every Thursday afternoon, always precisely 4:17, always leaving before sunset, always driven by an older man wearing the same dark baseball cap. No visitors, no deliveries, no obvious routine beyond absolute consistency. Consistency fascinated investigators. Human beings drift. They improvise. Perfect routine often hides deliberate discipline. Garbage collection finally provided opportunity. The pickup departed. Minutes later, sanitation workers emptied roadside containers. Investigators recovered several discarded coffee cups, plastic utensils, food packaging, everything transported under controlled chain of custody. The laboratory worked through the weekend. Cross barely slept. Monday morning arrived with rain. The analyst entered carrying no expression whatsoever. Experienced detectives understood that emotionless faces often carried the biggest news. We compared the discarded DNA. Cross waited. It doesn't match. Silence. Months of work. Nothing. Then the analyst continued. But hope returned again. It matches someone who handled the tape. Cross frowned. What do you mean? The DNA belongs to whoever packaged the evidence. The room froze. Cross looked at the report again. 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 The realization arrived slowly. Not the killer. An investigator. Someone inside the original investigation. Someone whose DNA transferred onto the evidence decades earlier while sealing the envelope. The tape had remained untouched because the investigator accidentally contaminated it before proper. Forensic procedures existed. Disappointment swept through the room. Until Bennett spoke from the doorway. Maybe not. Everyone turned. He carried another folder. The contaminated profile belongs to Detective Harold Mason. Cross recognized the name instantly. Lead investigator. Original case commander. Dead for 17 years. So, Bennett opened the folder. Mason kept personal notebooks. Cross stared. They were never submitted. Where are they? They weren't. Silence. They were found yesterday. Every eye fixed upon him. In a storage locker. Cross felt something shift deep inside the investigation. What was inside? Bennett smiled for the first time in weeks. 43 notebooks. The storage locker had remained unpaid for decades until the management company prepared everything. For public auction, an employee opening abandoned contents discovered boxes labeled only with dates. Before disposal, someone noticed faded police department markings and contacted local authorities. Inside waited an investigator's entire private archive. Daily observations. Witness impressions never included in official reports. Maps covered with handwritten circles. Names crossed out. Questions unanswered. Suspicions never proven. Cross carefully opened the first notebook. Harold Mason's handwriting filled every page. The final entry stopped her cold. Not because of what it said. Because of the date. 3 days before Mason died. The final sentence occupied an entire page. I finally know who lied. No name. No explanation. Nothing else. Only those 5 words. Outside, thunder rolled across the evening sky. Inside the cold case office, 40 years of silence had finally begun to speak. Harold Voss had been dead for nearly 18 years when Detective Evelyn Cross turned the final page of his forgotten notebook. Yet his handwriting carried an urgency that felt impossibly alive. Every line became sharper toward the end. The neat script slowly surrendering to hurried strokes that cut across the paper as though he had been racing against time itself. The last completed entry ended without explanation. There were no conclusions, no names circled in red, no dramatic confession hidden between the margins. Only a simple sentence written twice. once carefully and once with enough pressure to nearly tear the page. Someone changed the timeline. Cross stared at the words while rain rattled against the office windows. Investigators often made mistakes. Witnesses forgot. Evidence deteriorated. But timelines did not simply change. Someone had to change them. The next morning, every document from the original investigation was pulled from storage. Thousands of pages filled the conference room until the tables disappeared beneath decades of reports. Photographs, dispatch logs, forensic summaries, handwritten interview transcripts, and faded maps. Officers moved silently between stacks, comparing one version of events against another. Within hours, a pattern emerged. The first timeline, created during the initial 48 hours of the investigation, differed from every version produced afterward. Not dramatically, only by minutes. 6 minutes. According to the earliest dispatch records, the victim's abandoned car had been reported at 9:14 p.m. Every later report listed the discovery at 9:20 p.m. 6 insignificant minutes. 6 minutes that no one had questioned for 40 years. Cross requested the original emergency radio recordings. The communications archive warned that tapes from that era were incomplete, damaged, and difficult to recover. Still, technicians managed to restore fragments buried beneath layers of static. Voices crackled through aging speakers. Patrol units checking intersections. Dispatchers confirming addresses. Routine traffic. Then, almost hidden beneath interference, came a transmission no written transcript had ever mentioned. That possible second vehicle leaving North Access Road. The recording dissolved into static before the dispatcher repeated. Unit 12, repeat your last transmission. No response. Cross replayed the audio again. And again. Every investigator in the room heard the same thing. A second vehicle. Not one. 2. No report mentioned another vehicle. No witness had ever been asked about one. Someone had erased it from the investigation. Not accidentally. Deliberately. The discovery changed everything. For decades, investigators believed the killer acted alone. Now another possibility emerged. Someone could have helped, or watched, or followed. The case that had revolved around a single unidentified figure suddenly expanded into something far more dangerous. Analysts began reconstructing the road network exactly as it existed 40 years earlier. Satellite imagery did not exist. Digital maps were impossible. Instead, they relied on aerial photographs, county engineering plans, insurance surveys, and newspaper archives. Entire roads had disappeared beneath shopping centers. Bridges had been rebuilt. Tree lines had shifted. What looked isolated today had once connected directly to an abandoned industrial route leading toward the river. Cross visited the location before sunrise. Nothing remained except cracked asphalt disappearing beneath weeds. Standing there, she realized something unsettling. The North Access Road offered a perfect escape. Invisible from the highway. Invisible from nearby houses. Invisible to anyone arriving from the opposite direction. It had never appeared in the official reconstruction, which meant the reconstruction itself had been incomplete or manipulated. That afternoon, another breakthrough arrived from the digital forensics team. While scanning Harold Voss's notebooks, software detected impressions pressed into several blank pages. The detective had written on sheets that had later been removed. Invisible indentations remained. Specialized imaging recovered fragments of missing notes. Most were unreadable. One sentence emerged clearly. Check the blue pickup again. Cross-searched every surviving report. No blue pickup. Not one reference. Nothing. As though the vehicle had never existed. Except buried inside forgotten impressions invisible to the human eye. Motor vehicle archives became the next destination. Registration databases from 4 decades earlier had never been digitized completely. Volunteers carried dusty ledgers from basement storage. Microfilm readers hummed continuously for 3 days. Thousands of registrations passed beneath tired eyes. Then analyst Noah Bennett stopped turning pages. There. Registration number, HJ 4728. Vehicle, blue 1978 Ford F-150. Registered less than 3 miles from the original crime scene. Owner, Daniel Mercer. Cross frowned. She knew the name. Not from the investigation. From Harold Voss's retirement records. Mercer had attended the detective's funeral. A family friend. Silence settled across the archive room. Coincidence suddenly felt very expensive. Background investigators built Daniel Mercer's life from public records. Construction worker. Volunteer firefighter. Married twice. No criminal convictions. No arrests. Respected in the community. He had donated to youth charities. Coached Little League Baseball. Served on neighborhood safety committees. The perfect biography. Too perfect. Cross had learned something after 20 years investigating homicide. Real lives contain disorder. Perfect histories usually mean someone has spent years polishing them. Surveillance began quietly. Mercer was 74 now. He lived alone beside a quiet lake surrounded by pine forest. Every morning, he fed birds. Every afternoon, he repaired antique furniture inside an old workshop. Every evening, he sat on the porch exactly 30 minutes before sunset. Nothing appeared suspicious. Nothing except one habit. Every Friday at precisely 8:40 p.m., Mercer drove 15 miles into town. He parked outside the abandoned railway station. He never left his truck. He remained exactly 20 minutes. Then returned home. Every week. Without exception. Investigators watched for 5 consecutive Fridays. The pattern never changed. Cross finally decided to visit the station herself after Mercer departed. The building stood empty. Graffiti covered broken walls. Wind moved loose sheets of rusted metal across collapsed platforms. Nothing. Then Bennett noticed fresh tire tracks behind the station. Not many. One vehicle. Always backing into the same position. Facing west. Toward a forgotten freight tunnel. Cross walked through knee-high weeds until she reached the tunnel entrance. Someone had recently cleared branches away. Inside, flashlight beams revealed old railway markings. Dot and hundreds of candle stubs. Some fresh. Some decades old. Photographs covered one wall. Not newspaper clippings. Not victims. Landscapes. Roads. Bridges. Parking lots. Empty intersections. Every photograph showed places. Never people. Pinned beside them hung maps connected with red thread. Cross felt the same sensation investigators described when entering a crime scene where nothing immediately makes sense. You know you're looking at something important. You simply don't yet know why. Then Bennett found the notebook. Unlike Harold Voss's journals, this one looked new. The final page had been written only days earlier. One sentence. He knows someone is reading the old files. Cross slowly lowered the notebook. No one answered. A radio crackled outside. One surveillance officer shouted from the entrance. "Detective!" She ran. The officer pointed toward the parking area. Mercer's truck. That was gone. No one had seen it leave. Yet every surveillance unit had remained in position. Cross looked back toward the tunnel. The notebook. The photographs. The candles. Someone had expected them to arrive. Not only expected, prepared. On the wall opposite the entrance, illuminated by a single flashlight beam, words appeared that none of them had noticed before. Painted directly onto the concrete. Fresh enough to still smell. You are 40 years late. No one spoke for several seconds. The words stretched across the damp concrete wall in thick black paint, still glistening beneath the flashlight beams. You are 40 years late. Detective Evelyn Cross stepped closer without touching the surface. The odor of fresh paint lingered in the cold air. Whoever had written the message had done so recently, hours ago at most. They knew we'd come, Noah Bennett said quietly. Cross didn't answer. She wasn't looking at the message anymore. She was looking at the floor. A single muddy footprint crossed the dusty concrete before disappearing into darkness beyond the old freight tunnel. It wasn't the only print. There were dozens, some recent, others partially buried beneath years of dirt. Someone had been using this forgotten place for a very long time. Crime scene technicians sealed the tunnel before sunrise. Every inch was photographed, every fragment collected. Unlike investigators 40 years earlier, Cross refused to assume anything was insignificant. Dust, fibers, rust particles, old cigarette filters, broken glass, even insect remains. Modern investigations had taught her one lesson repeatedly. The smallest overlooked detail often carried the largest truth. By noon, the evidence room resembled a laboratory rather than a police facility. Tables filled with labeled containers. Digital scans rotated across enormous monitors. Artificial intelligence sorted decades of photographs, looking for repeated objects invisible to human memory. Then the software stopped. A notification appeared. Recurring object detected. Cross walked toward the screen. The computer highlighted something almost laughably ordinary. A street lamp. The same cast-iron street lamp appeared in 9 photographs taken over 38 years. Different cameras. Different detectives. Different crime scenes. Always somewhere in the background. Always ignored. Until now. Bennett enlarged the images. That's impossible. Cross nodded. The lamp never moved. No. He zoomed again. The photographer did. Silence filled the room. Every photograph had been taken from almost the exact same position. Not by coincidence. By habit. Someone kept returning to the same place to watch. The location no longer existed. Urban redevelopment had demolished the intersection 22 years earlier. Cross visited the city archives. Old engineering plans revealed what modern maps no longer showed. Beneath the demolished intersection remained an abandoned municipal maintenance corridor running. Beneath downtown, officially sealed, officially inaccessible, officially forgotten. Nothing about this investigation respected the word officially anymore. The steel access hatch weighed nearly 400 pounds. Rust screamed as officers forced it open. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the smell of stagnant water and ancient concrete. The tunnel below stretched into darkness. Every 50 feet, another maintenance light hung lifeless from the ceiling. Cross descended first. Boots echoed softly. The corridor branched repeatedly beneath the city like veins beneath skin. Most passages ended in collapsed walls. Others continued for hundreds of yards. Then they found the door. Unlike everything around it, the metal surface looked relatively new. Someone maintained it. There was no lock. Only a handwritten sign taped across the center. Please knock. Nobody moved. Cross raised her flashlight. 3 slow knocks. Nothing. Another 3. Silence. She pushed gently. The door opened. Inside waited a room no larger than a garage. Bookshelves covered every wall. Hundreds of binders. Thousands of newspaper clippings. Cassette tapes. Photographs. Maps. Police scanners. Radio equipment. Computers built from parts spanning 30 years. The room wasn't abandoned. It was organized. Painfully organized. Each shelf carried handwritten labels. 1987, 1988, 1989. The years continued until the present. Cross slowly realized what she was seeing. Someone had been documenting investigations for decades. Not one case. All of them. Every major disappearance. Every unsolved homicide. Every suspicious fire. Every unidentified body. An archive built by a ghost. Bennett picked up one binder. His face lost color. Detective. Inside rested surveillance photographs. Of police officers. Cross turned another page. There were more. Different years. Different detectives. Different chiefs. Every generation of investigators had unknowingly been photographed. Someone had watched the people doing the watching. Forensic teams worked through the night. Fingerprints covered the room. Most belonged to unknown individuals. One set appeared repeatedly. Same prints. Same hand. Everything had been touched by the same person. Coffee mugs. Binders. Door handles. Camera lenses. The unknown archivist had lived here. But not recently. Food containers dated back nearly 8 months. Dust patterns suggested a sudden departure. No signs of struggle. No blood. No hurried escape. Just absence. As though the occupant had calmly stood up one day. And walked away forever. The oldest cassette tape attracted immediate attention. Its label simply read, "Start here." Technicians digitized the recording. Static filled the speakers. A click. Then breathing. Heavy. Controlled. A man's voice emerged. "If you're hearing this." Another pause. Then Harold failed. Cross exchanged a glance with Bennett. Harold. Harold Voss. The detective whose notebooks had reopened everything. The recording continued. "I told him not to trust anyone above lieutenant." Another breath. He wouldn't listen. The tape skipped violently. Several seconds disappeared forever. Then, they changed the evidence. Silence. "I copied everything." Another skip. "If they find this room." Static swallowed several words. "That means they finally know I existed." The recording ended. Nobody spoke. The unknown speaker had anticipated discovery decades earlier. Which meant the archive wasn't simply documentation. It was insurance. Cross requested voice comparison. The database found no match. Not police. Not military. Not public broadcasts. Nothing. Either the speaker had never appeared in any recorded system. Or someone had erased him from every system available. Late that evening, another discovery arrived. One binder contained city telephone directories dating back half a century. Most pages were ordinary, until analysts noticed tiny pencil dots beside certain names. Exactly 37 names. Cross-order background checks. The results unsettled everyone. 24 were dead. 7 had disappeared. 5 had changed identities through legal name changes. 1 that had become mayor. Mayor Richard Ellison had served 3 terms. Popular. Charismatic. A former prosecutor. Public advocate for victims' families. His biography appeared spotless. Yet one photograph from 39 years earlier showed something unexpected. A young Richard Ellison standing beside Detective Harold Voss. Both smiling. Both attending the opening of the original investigation headquarters. Cross turned the photograph over. Someone had written a date. Nothing else. Until ultraviolet light revealed hidden ink beneath the surface. One sentence slowly appeared. He wasn't supposed to be there. The next morning, Cross requested access to the mayor's archive schedules. City legal advisors objected. No probable causa. No warrant. No authority. Hours passed arguing procedure. By sunset, approval finally arrived. Cross opened the oldest appointment ledger. One entry had been removed with a razor blade. Not crossed out. Not erased. Cut away completely. Only the surrounding paper remained. The missing appointment fell on exactly the same night the original victim vanished 40 years earlier. At 8:12 p.m., Bennett burst into the office carrying a portable hard drive. "You need to see this." "What is it?" "I rebuilt one of the damaged surveillance videos." Cross frowned. "There wasn't surveillance 40 years ago." There wasn't. He connected the drive. The screen displayed grainy security footage. Not from 40 years ago. From yesterday. The camera overlooked the entrance to the abandoned railway station. Mercer's blue pickup entered the frame precisely on schedule. It stopped. Waited. Then another vehicle approached from the opposite direction. Black sedan. No license plate visible. The driver stepped out. Only for 3 seconds. Just enough for Mercer to hand over a thick envelope. Then both vehicles drove away. Bennett froze the image. Cross leaned closer. The sedan driver's face remained hidden beneath shadow. But one detail stood out. A distinctive silver ring shaped like a raven with its wings spread wide. Cross felt her pulse quicken. She had seen that ring before. Not in evidence. Not in photographs. Not in the tunnel. She stood slowly. Without saying a word, she walked to the framed picture hanging beside the hallway outside her office. The annual police awards ceremony. Taken 15 years earlier. Dozens of officers smiling. City officials applauding. Standing in the center. Dot shaking hands with Detective Harold Voss. Where's Mayor Richard de Gison? On his right hand, the same silver raven ring. The photograph remained pinned beneath the evidence light long after everyone in the room stopped. Speaking. A silver raven. Nothing more than a piece of jewelry. Nothing less than the first physical detail connecting two worlds investigators had never believed. Belong together. Cold cases survive because facts disappear. Conspiracies survive because facts become ordinary. Detective Evelyn Cross understood the difference. She didn't order an arrest. She didn't call the mayor. She didn't even mention the ring outside the task force. Instead, she asked a simpler question. How many people own one? By sunrise, jewelers across 3 states had been contacted. Most had never seen the design. One elderly craftsman finally recognized it. I made those, he said over the phone. How many? 12. When? A long time ago. Who bought them? They weren't sold. Cross waited. They were commissioned. The craftsman searched faded ledgers stacked in cardboard boxes older than some of his employees. I remember because the customer insisted every ring be identical. He found the page. Commission date. October 14th. 41 years earlier. Quantity. 12. Customer name. Not listed. Only initials. RC. Delivery address. A building that no longer existed. The old Hawthorne Athletic Club. The club had burned to the ground 36 years ago. Official cause. Electrical fire. Insurance investigators closed the file within days. Cross reopened it. Photographs of the ruins appeared ordinary until digital enhancement isolated one overlooked detail. The fire had burned outward, not inward. Someone had ignited multiple points simultaneously. It hadn't been an accident. It had been destruction. What was inside? Bennett asked. City archives answered. Membership records. Private meeting rooms. Locked filing cabinets. Everything had vanished in the fire, including the list of the club's final members. One document survived by accident. A newspaper photographer had captured the club's annual charity dinner weeks before the fire. Nearly 200 guests filled the ballroom. Artificial intelligence sharpened the image. Faces slowly emerged from a blur. Business owners, lawyers, judges, police officers, city officials, and 12 men standing together in identical silver raven rings. No banner identified them. No caption mentioned them. Yet every one of them faced the camera while everyone else looked toward the stage, as though they already knew where history would be looking decades later. Cross assembled a timeline unlike any the department had ever attempted. Not one murder. Not one disappearance. Every major unsolved violent crime over 40 years. Colored strings spread across an entire wall. Victims. Locations. Witnesses. Political appointments. Transfers inside the police department. Property sales. Insurance claims. One by one, the lines began intersecting. Not enough for a courtroom. Enough for investigators. Patterns emerged where coincidence should have ended. Witnesses relocated shortly before scheduled testimony. Evidence rooms renovated immediately after critical discoveries. Anonymous letters arriving days before search warrants. Detectives reassigned without explanation. Every event, standing alone, appeared harmless. Together, they formed something else. A system. Not perfect. Not invisible. Simply patient. The breakthrough arrived from the youngest member of the team. Analyst Mia Chun had spent 3 sleepless nights studying financial records everyone else considered irrelevant. She entered the room carrying only one sheet of paper. I think we've been asking the wrong question. Cross looked up. We've been trying to find who committed the first murder. And what if the first murder wasn't the beginning? Silence settled. Mia placed the document on the table. It was a land purchase. 42 years old. 12 signatures. 12 investors. 1 parcel of undeveloped woodland. Cross recognized the location immediately. The woodland no longer existed. It had become Raven Memorial Park, the place where the fictional victim from the original cold case had been found. No one had noticed because ownership records disappeared once the city acquired the land. Until now. Search warrants followed. Not dramatic raids. Quiet requests for archived banking documents. Most records have been destroyed decades earlier. 1 microfilm survived inside a federal storage facility. Transfers. Shell companies. Property taxes. Hidden beneath ordinary accounting, millions of dollars had flowed through businesses that officially never made a profit. Every transaction eventually touched the same private trust. The trust still existed. Its current chairman, Richard Ellison. The task force prepared carefully. No leaks. No press conferences. No dramatic speeches. Just evidence. 1 warrant. Then another. Every step documented twice. Cross understood that if even one procedure failed, 40 years of work could collapse. At dawn, officers entered the mayor's lakeside estate. Ellison was waiting in the kitchen. He neither resisted nor appeared surprised. He looked at Cross for several seconds before speaking. I wonder which file would find me. She placed the warrant on the table. We're here about the Hawthorne Club. A faint smile crossed his face. So Harold finally talked. Cross didn't answer. He left notebooks. Ellison looked out the window. He always wrote everything down. The interview lasted 6 hours. He denied murder. Denied conspiracy. Denied ordering evidence destroyed. But denial has limits. Especially when confronted with documents, recordings, financial records, and decades of forgotten paperwork finally assembled into one coherent picture. Then Cross placed the final item on the table. The cassette recording. The unknown man's voice. Ellison listened without expression. When the tape ended, he whispered only one sentence. I thought he destroyed that. The unknown speaker was identified 2 weeks later. Not through DNA. Not through fingerprints. Through a forgotten pension application discovered in an abandoned state archive. His name was Thomas Avery, an investigative reporter, officially missing for 39 years. Unofficially, he had spent years documenting corruption, linking powerful figures, compromised investigators, and organized financial crimes hidden beneath unrelated criminal investigations. His underground archive had never been intended to solve one murder. It had been built to expose an entire network. He vanished before publishing a single page. No trace of him was ever found. Months later, the task force headquarters looked different. The evidence wall had come down. Boxes were sealed. Reports completed. Some suspects faced prosecution. Others had died decades earlier. Several questions remained unanswered. Thomas Avery was still missing. The identity of the person who painted you are 40 years late inside the railway tunnel was never established. Daniel Mercer disappeared before investigators could question him again. His blue pickup was found abandoned beside an empty highway hundreds of miles away. The keys remained in the ignition. Nothing else. On Evelyn Cross's final day with the cold case unit, she returned alone to the abandoned freight tunnel. The room beneath the city had been emptied months earlier. Shelves removed. Evidence cataloged. Dust settled where secrets once lived. She stood quietly, preparing to leave forever. Then she noticed something she had somehow missed. A loose brick. Behind it rested a plain white envelope. No fingerprints. No address. Inside was a single photograph, taken only days before. It showed Cross herself leaving police headquarters. On the back, written in careful block letters, were 8 words. Some archives never close. They only change keepers. She looked up. The tunnel was silent. Empty. Yet somewhere beyond the darkness, footsteps echoed once. Dot, and then disappeared forever.